Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video in the 12 Days of Deltarune. I did a video about my Chapter 3 predictions quite a while ago, because we had a lot of information about Chapter 3, I felt like I could make predictions. But it has been up until now that I've been unsure about Chapter 4 predictions, and the situation is just changing so fast these days. Even this image is outdated because I do not think Image Friend is going to be in Chapter 4 anymore. But that's not a major part of the my predictions anyway, so sorry for the cut. One of my neighbors started up a very loud motorcycle the second I started recording. Very cool. Anyway, chapter format. So in Chapter 3, this was very simple. It was the idea of we're going to different channels. This one's a little bit different, but I did have an idea, all right? Because I think the main theme is going to be essentially arts and crafts. And the reason I think this is because Chapter 4 is clearly, I think at this point, set in the church. And yet, we have these weirdly contradictory images of Noelle in a closet full of Christmas supplies and a bunch of like Christmas decorations, which like, how do we make those two things go together? So the idea is perhaps in Chapter 4, it's sort of the prelude to the actual chapter. I still think we're going to go to the church service, which is what's going to gather everybody together. And then there's going to be some sort of festival event that people need to get set up in the church, probably a dance, based on Burger Pants' sprite where he's pointing and freaking out with punch all over his mouth. And some of the concept art we've got of violently drinking punch and Susie taking a huge like glass of punch out of the bowl. A lot of punch-based humor. Anyway, the idea is they have to decorate the church for this festival event, and they go into the church's, like, I don't know, closet to find some decorations, and they're all Christmas decorations, which means they need to make the decorations themselves, which is where the arts and crafts part comes in. We know that Guy, or Guay, maybe? I still not 100% on the pronunciation, but I think Guay is closer, is some sort of talisman, probably. Given the fact that its name references a ghost, and these sort of talismans are used to ward off evil spirits. And its body shape looks a lot like the talisman with like a bell on top, right? Or some sort of ornament, anyway. We know that Caddy is probably going to have some sort of involvement in this chapter, because Jockington is probably going to have some sort of involvement in this chapter based on the graffiti of him. So what if Caddy's the one who makes these talismans? We already know she's into like magic, essentially. So maybe that could work out. And it would also explain that Jockington graffiti, because of course Jockington's decorations are going to be Jockington themed. Anyway, all of this coming together creates sort of like a mishmash of holidays for the Dark World theme when eventually the Dark World gets created in the church. So perhaps the chapter's sort of progression goes from one season to another until eventually we get to winter. So we start in spring, let's say, and then we go, you know, summer, fall, and we end in winter where things are dark and gloomy. I think this kind of goes along with the newsletters too, because we got a bunch of different holiday newsletters. Like we got a Valentine's Day newsletter, we got a Christmas newsletter, we got a Halloween newsletter, which they didn't have to do, right? So I think that might be intentional here. I have specifically the angel doll listed as one of the decorations I think could be involved in this chapter, and I'll get into why later. But the idea that as the chapter goes on, things get darker, potentially based on Noelle's fears about Rudy's health, essentially. I think Noelle's definitely going to be here, based on these images of her in Chapter 4. So the idea that, I mean, I believe personally that the Dark Worlds are somewhat influenced by the Lightners who are there when they're formed, or who are exploring them. It is their sort of thoughts about objects that inform how those objects become Darkners, which is why, for example, Top Chef, despite just being a spinning top, turns into a chef and then into a baker, because Susie is hungry. So her connotations about a spinning top is like spinning pizza, but I'm hungry, and pizza's kind of like pie, and I like cake better, so I want cake. And that's how we get there, which is why Ralsei knows that Susie likes cake. Anyway, that's a tangent. My idea is essentially Noelle's going to essentially make this world worse and worse with her own growing fears about what's going on. And that the main boss, because of chess theory, is probably going to be some sort of like religious adjacent character, some sort of like moral leader, who eventually turns into, as the world gets darker, sort of a dangerous cult-like figure that's controlling people through their, faith in them. Not necessarily faith in a religion, but faith in them as a leader, right? And the reason for that is because of chess theory. So far in chess theory, we have had a king, which is obviously the most valuable piece in chess, because if your king gets taken, you lose. A queen, who is the most strictly valuable piece in chess, because, it can get taken and you don't lose. But it is obviously the most powerful. You can see in this chart here, a queen is listed as 9 points. A rook is listed as 5. And so if chess theory is true, rook, in some sense, should be in chapter 3. Probably not specifically just called rook. I think it's going to get a little more... because queen wasn't actually called queen either. She was called like QU57 whatever, and then simplified her name to queen. I think something similar could be going on there. Like maybe the rook's name is something different, but like its initials are ROOK somehow. The bishop and the knight, however, are the same amount of points each, which led me to this idea, well, me and other people, to this idea that the bishop and the knight are actually going to be one character. And originally I thought this was going to be because the bishop was going to be revealed to be a Lightner, in fact, and be the knight. It could still happen that way, but I'm a little less confident in that now. So instead, my new idea is that the bishop character is going to start off as like a friendly sort of moral leader, and then turn into a crusader type knight character, perhaps more in line with the whims of the knight as well, like wanting to create more dark fountains. And one of the most fun things about chess theory is that queens and kings' actions kind of mirror their own chess pieces' movements on a chessboard. Like, you leave your king at the back because you don't want the king to get cornered generally. So in chapter 1, king stays at his castle and doesn't come out to meet us at any point before that. Whereas queen is a piece that you move all over the board because it's so powerful and can move wherever it wants. Queen also very powerful and moves wherever she wants in chapter 2. My idea for chapter 3 with rook was essentially that the character would only be able to deal with you in straightforward means. Like, the character can't be sly and backstab you. So instead of trying to control you through fear or anything, they're trying to control you through contracts and paperwork and, stuff that's legit, but not necessarily good for you. And then with the bishop and the knight, here's my idea about it, okay? The bishop part's a little weaker than the knight part. But the idea is the bishop lets their subjects handle things until eventually jumping over their subjects as the knight. Because the knight has 2 abilities, technically, which is rare for a chess piece. It can move in its L-shaped form, which I'm sure this character will take an L at the end of this chapter, but that's not really relevant. But it also has the power to move over top of other pieces, which is something no other piece can do. So we're taking that sort of for essentially jumping the chain of command and taking control of everything, like, personally. And then the bishop is usually a piece on the board that you want to kind of keep in the back, far away from the front lines. The reason being, the bishop can move across the entire board diagonally. So you don't really have any incentive to move it up on the board too much unless you're already threatening another piece. So that was my thoughts anyway. So yeah, I already said starts off as a friendly NPC before becoming sinister, sort of mirroring, Noelle's feelings about starting off as like everything's okay and things keep getting worse and worse. And then is able to convince Caddy and Jockington to turn on Susie. I thought this was interesting because the one thing we know about Caddy is that she does not like Susie. So the idea that this trustable person who potentially endears themselves to Caddy is able to convince her and Jockington by proxy, because Jockington is just going to follow what Caddy does, I'm sure, to turn on Susie specifically, driving this sort of like wedge between the group, is an interesting idea to me. So, speaking of Caddy and Jockington, I don't think either of them are going to take on like a big Noelle type main character role. Neither of them really feel main character material. They feel much more Birdly material, which is why I say they'll function as Birdlies. Where they're like in there and they'll have scenes, but they're not like the main focus of the story of the chapter. I think Caddy in the Dark World is going to be focused on trying to make sure Susie and Noelle do not get together, because we know that Caddy does not want Susie and Noelle to get together because she thinks Susie's evil. And clearly, I mean, this is chapter 4. It's 2 chapters after chapter 2 where Susie and Noelle were already getting a lot closer. They're probably going to be very close at this point to actually maybe even breaching a relationship. So Caddy's on, red alert or whatever, which makes it extra easy for her to fall for the bishop's dark take on Susie as being the violent tormentor or whatever. And also Jockington's there. And maybe, we're pretty sure this chapter is going to have a weird route based on the sweepstakes. The new sweepstakes stuff. So perhaps because of this wedge that's being driven into the group by whoever the chapter 4 boss is, Noelle and Chris are able to be separated again, and we go back to getting stronger. Or alternatively, there's an achievement that we got hinted at in one of the newsletters to complete chapter 3 without issue. And there's been the theory for a long time that all the main characters' names are anagrams, because Ralsei's name is clearly an anagram of Azrael. So Chris's name is an anagram of risk, and Susie's name is an anagram of issue. So complete without issue might mean complete without Susie. And in that case, Susie wouldn't even be here. So what would happen? Everything would be different. And yeah, the idea that Chris could isolate Noelle again is pretty similar to what happens in chapter 2. And then Caddy would be trying to split Noelle and Chris from, hanging out, because clearly Chris is a bad influence on her. So yeah, that's how it goes. Okay, the secret boss. I talked about the angel doll earlier. Here's where that comes back up. We know the sky mantle is an item, and we've got a lot of hints that we're going to need some sort of mantle to defeat one of the secret bosses, whether that be the chapter 3 secret boss or the chapter 4 secret boss. Maybe both, because the sky mantle reflects holy attacks and electric attacks. And chapter 3 secret boss is very likely to have electric attacks, considering the whole TV thing, where chapter 4 is way more likely to have holy attacks, considering the whole church background. So perhaps this angel doll, or maybe a second angel doll, like Des and Noelle worked on this angel doll. Did Azrael and Chris also work on an angel doll back in the church? This also sets up the whole arts and crafts thing with the church, potentially. So, maybe this angel doll comes back in this chapter as some sort of secret boss, symbolizing a loss of touch with reality or losing one's self-image. They have no face. The angel doll has no facial features, which makes it unsettling to Chris. So that coming back would also make sense. And yeah, I already talked about the mantle. So what's the main theme? I speculated that chapter 3's main theme is going to be about fractured partnerships, with Toriel and Asgore obviously being a big one. Potentially Mike and Spampton, if Mike is actually going to be a character. It seems more and more likely every day. And then maybe even the main chapter boss is going to have a former duo partner that they no longer have. I mean, we have La Niña and El Niño, after all, the Weathers, who are clearly partners in crime, so it seems somewhat likely. Chapter 4, however, I think is going to be something like toxic positivity. It's something like Noelle is trying to ignore everything going on in her light world life and just fully invest in the dark world. In other words, exactly what we think was going to happen, but, you know. And that's mirrored, of course, in the main chapter boss, who just wants to pretend that everything is fine, even as their dark world is getting worse and worse with the changing of the seasons and, you know, the snow sealing people in. It's cold. It's, there's no food or something like that. And then over the course of the chapter, depending on whether you're on the weird route or not, Noelle's either able to come back to her senses and we kind of break away from this whole dark world fascination, or obviously, she does not do that and fully leans into abandoning the light world in favor of the dark world. Either way, though, I'm pretty sure the main chapter boss is going to essentially fall into a darker persona, like take on a more sinister role, switch from the bishop to the knight, essentially. And then the secret boss, if it is the doll and is faceless, for example, has lost touch with their identity. They've lost control of their sense of self, essentially. So where Noelle and the main chapter boss have lost their willing to accept reality, the secret boss has lost their ability to see themselves as real at all. If you haven't done the weird route in chapter 2, this chapter would foreshadow the weird route with Noelle, you know, wanting to do dark fountain-y stuff, which might allow you to go back and do the weird route if you didn't hear about it online. And then, if it does go darker than dark, which the Chapter 4 trailer kind of seems like it might be going darker than dark, then the world itself would follow along with this theme by losing touch with its own reality, turning into something completely different. And finally, what is the boss going to be? So I think it would make a lot of sense if the boss is someone who's sort of a commander more than a ruler, that the boss is sort of like, I don't know how to explain it. It's one of those RPG bosses with minions, essentially, which is how I put it in the title, so I could have just said that. Whatever. The main boss themselves is not super strong, but because they're supported by all these lesser enemies, and maybe you can't target the main boss until you defeat the lesser enemies, it makes the battle as challenging as a normal boss battle would be. Something like that. And then because they're all, you know, driven by fanaticism, you can't spare them the normal way. You have to go out of your way in order to spare them with, say, pacify by harming them, but not, you know, straight up defeating them and then using pacify after they're tired, which is a mechanic in the game, by the way, if you didn't know that. If you attack an enemy enough and its health is low enough, you can use pacify because it gets tired. Or something else, something more creative. Sort of, you know, a throwback to Undertale. And then when the fight's over, the bishop commands someone to open another dark fountain, which then leads to the darker than dark segment. Essentially, they've completely bought into like this whole role of becoming the new knight or whatever. And yeah, that's it. That is the end of this little mini theory. Let me know what your predictions for Chapter 4 are. I would be interested to see them before we get the chapters in a few days here now. Woo. And yeah, like and subscribe, I guess. I'm excited for the new chapters. I hope you are too. Yee. Okay, bye.